You're listening to the Entrepreneur to Author podcast, episode number 24.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur to Author podcast, the podcast that brings you practical strategies for building authority and growing your business. And now, here's your host, Scott McMillan.
It's said that writing a book is a marathon, not a sprint. And there's truth to that metaphor. Both take commitment, dedication, a plan to get from the starting line to an endpoint far off in the distance. Both favor a daily, habitual routine over heroic one-time bursts of energy that deliver quick results, but leave you drained with nothing left to give, just when you need to give your best. Both improve with experience. Both are seen as incredibly impressive achievements. And more importantly, finishing a marathon or writing a book, both serve as a signal to yourself that you can achieve far more than you previously thought possible. My guest today is witness to this metaphor. If you guessed that he's written a book and completed a marathon, well, you wouldn't be wrong. He has, and he has. But that's not the half of it. He's written 3 books. And he's completed multiple ultramarathons and Ironman races, some with distances of more than 100 kilometers, setting numerous course records and representing Australia at the Ironman World Championships in Hawaii. He knows what it takes to go the distance. And he's here to share his tips and experience with us, both for running your best race and for writing your best book. So now, get ready and get set for this edition of Entrepreneur to Author. My guest today is Nick Muxlow. Nick is a running coach and ultramarathon runner with more than 18 years of endurance racing experience. He's the founder of the Ultra Journey and author of 3 books, Journey to 100, Journey to Kona, and his most recent book, Run Fit. He's well known for helping his clients improve their running and finish with a smile. Nick, welcome to Entrepreneur to Author. Thanks so much for joining us.
Awesome. Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me on here. I'm really excited to jump in and have a bit of a conversation with you.
Absolutely. So maybe to start, why don't you share a little bit about your personal story? How did you get started with endurance running, and how has that led to what you do today with your business?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, to start with endurance running is not ever, as a kid, you don't sort of wake up and kind of go, that's what I want to do. So I find, for myself, I initially played chase in the schoolyard. That's how kids kind of learn to run. And so really obviously loved that a lot. But I played team sport for a number of years. I played lacrosse, actually 16 years. And basically within that, I played through the center. So that meant I could run all day, which was basically the next best thing, chasing after a little ball rolling around the park. And then that sort of progressed into triathlon, and then ultimately from there long distance triathlon, and then into the ultra running. So it's, I guess, much more of a gradual crescendo progression that I guess I've been through, because ultra running is often something that's more of an older person's sport than someone that's straight out of college or that sort of thing. So it's worked out really well.
Yeah, I don't know if you knew this, but lacrosse is actually one of Canada's national sports. We have 2, hockey and lacrosse.
Yeah, totally. Initially, I had friends that went and played in the college system over there, in the competition that I played here. We had lots of people come over from Canada and America and play in our team. My brother continued to play and actually went on to represent Australia at the National Lacrosse Championships. So he played against the Americans and the Canadians in Israel when it was held there. So well and truly involved in the sport and know where its origins come from, and where some very good lacrosse players live. That's for sure.
Oh, fantastic. Nice. So in general, fitness training seems like a competitive market, but it seems to me that you've taken a passion or interest in the endurance running and paired that with your skills and experience as an educator to create a business that is really quite focused and well-tailored to you and what makes you unique. Could you talk a little bit about, I guess, whether or not that sort of niching down has been important for you in your business? And if so, how has that helped?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess the first part was really like, there's kind of two parts to the question. So the first one's really, I guess, sort of how I've ended up coaching. And so I always had a fascination with coaching. It must be sort of in the genes or something, because my dad was a coach for the lacrosse team. So he did that for many years, obviously was a player himself prior to, when he was younger. And so I actually started, coaching the juniors originally. But when you're sort of that age, you're kind of like, well, it's not really something that you can make a quid off. And so that was where it's like, well, I kind of went to what I saw as the next best thing, which was like, I'm going to be a PE teacher. Like, it's kind of like coaching, it sort of fits. And so I did that. And basically from there, I was just totally immersed in long distance triathlon. Like, just loved it. You have to just live it and breathe it to be able to compete and obviously make it over to Hawaii as an age group athlete. And so that basically then from there sort of, I guess, culminated with, I had this education. I had this education degree. I had this interest in sports science, and I had this interest in coaching. And I sort of always originally thought, I'll coach when I'm a bit older. And actually went through a really challenging time at a school. And so basically, I'd been a PE teacher. That was fantastic. But I was looking for like permanency. So I was just contract, which means you just come and go. Like you're there one year and you might not be there the next. And so I started with this job, and basically was then in the classroom. And basically the school just didn't work out. So I just couldn't get the kids to settle. I personally didn't feel I had the support of leadership either within that role. And basically it sort of culminated with them saying, look, fix the class or leave. And kind of my nature is to just dig in and go, nah, like you do what it takes, like you don't quit. And basically I had a few days off. Actually got food poisoning, crazily enough. And so basically I ended up with these few days off, and I was like, initially I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go fix this. And then it kind of just dawned on me. I was like, sometimes you're just fighting a losing battle. Like if I don't have the support elsewhere, I was completely new to the school. And so that's when I'm like, nah, I just want to put things in my own court. And for me, the way that I could put things in my own court versus like just bouncing around from contract work to contract work was basically, nah, you're going to be your own boss. And so I started coaching, and I started coaching actually, this probably for other entrepreneurs listening, like I was charging $120 for like the athletes that I was working with a month, and I'm doing the maths on it, and like, you don't have to do too much hard maths. And it's like, I just can't make this work, but it gave me a starting point. And I figured, and I've always said to myself, before I hit the bottom, I'm going to be able to deploy the parachute. So basically I just started, and just from there just continued. And that's really led down what has been a magnificent path. And so I look back on that and I'm like, wow, I was actually like, I hated it at the time. Just that stress with work, and just that, knowing that you're good at something, but then just not having that appreciated and not having the support. And, I'd worked in other schools that it was fantastic, loved it, did actually again after. But yeah, it was just a really challenging time, but it's always like, you don't necessarily see the glass half full part at the time. But, I sort of look back on that, what is probably 6 years down the track, and it's like, maybe I was really lucky that happened, because it gave me that motivation to just jump and just basically put things in my own court. So, yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting. And when you talk about when you first started coaching and how you were charging such a low price point,
mm-hmm.
What was it that kind of helped you address that? Did niching play a part in that?
Yeah, definitely. So there was multiple parts that played a role in it. I initially thought I'd coach triathletes. That was where I was known more so as an athlete myself. I obviously had this interest and, love of running, even within the triathlon. But I actually basically did a talk, and I spoke to a bunch of ultra runners. And then afterwards, I kind of, at the end of the talk, I just said, oh yeah, I coach people. If anyone wants to come on board, I was like super raw. Like I just did it because I enjoyed teaching and talking and that sort of thing. And I just got swamped afterwards. I was like, oh my goodness, like I've now got more trail and ultra runners that I'm coaching than I do triathletes. And so they were the ones that started to find me. And so that was sort of when it was like, okay, well, sure, like my skill set from triathlon to ultra running and the fact I love running, like that's a really easy playoff. But it was almost driven by the market initially. And then from there, I actually had everyone says niche, okay? And whenever you start to do it, you're always like reluctant. And so I definitely had that reluctance. And I initially found, it's interesting because I found that when I first niched, it was actually almost too small a niche. Okay. So like I was deliberately targeting 100-kilometer ultramarathon runners. And that ended up being a bit too small. And so then I went, oh, hang on, I've niched too small. Like that's such a small market that I then almost sort of went, okay, I've just got to like release the reins a little bit and just keep it to like runners. And so I sort of did that. And then I've actually now gone back the other way because I've now found that I've now got, as my credibility and authority has grown, it's actually really allowed me to then go back to what that first niche was. So I don't necessarily have what is an answer to anyone, but I guess the key thing is like, don't be scared to niche. Absolutely. Just try and get the niche to the right level. Okay. So I possibly went a little bit too focused initially. I should have possibly kept it, just slightly broader in terms of like half marathon runners, marathon runners, and ultra marathon runners. I definitely don't play around in like the 3-5K kind of space. And then, as you progress, you'll find that you get that authority builds, your understanding builds, and then you can just become really niche down. And that's what I've then basically started to go back to now. So I work, I definitely work with the marathon runners and the half marathon runners, but I pitch everything to the trail and the ultra runners. And what I find is that the marathon or the half marathon runners that have an interest in that area will find me. The triathletes that I coach often have an interest in trail and ultra running. Okay, so I've got that bullseye. And so I talk to that bullseye, but it definitely brings in just the periphery of those that still have that underlying focus. And it's been fantastic. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great way to think about that, and interesting that your market found you. That's often the way, and I think that that little bit of trial and error, kind of niching down like you did, expanding it if you need to, and then kind of reaching that happy medium is a really good approach. I often tell people that conceptually think about what niche could you realistically be number one at and be the absolute best at, and make that as big as you possibly can. I really love how you came to that. So I've mentioned to you that I've recently picked up running again myself. I ran long distance back in high school, and recently picked it back up. Of course, when all exercise moved outdoors during the pandemic. But I think many people think of coaching, particularly in athletics, as something that's meant for top level athletes rather than weekend warriors like me. Is that true? And if it's not, what's different in terms of how you work with and coach someone who has perhaps more or less experience?
Yeah, totally. It's one of the biggest misconceptions that I actually have to break down. Everyone is kind of like, oh, you're a really good runner. Like, you won't want to work with me. And it's actually not, like, that's the furthest from the truth. I have maybe a couple of people that I'd consider elite that I work with. And 99% of the people are either, they're not elite. Okay. So I definitely work with those that, fall into that term, the weekend warrior, right from, and this is just also then when word of mouth starts kicking in. So although I'm niched, I actually coach a couple of runners who are far from ultra runners, and they're right at the very start of the spectrum in running. And so the way I work with them is obviously totally different to the way that I work with someone that's doing 100K or 100 mile or dare I say 200 miler. And so, basically it has to do with coming back to your fundamental principles, which I guess just quickly are your frequency, your intensity, your time, and your type. And so we just basically look at, well, where you are at the moment. So if you're potentially running, say, 3 runs of 2 runs of half an hour through the week and then a run on the weekend that's an hour, well, that just gives us our starting point and we just build from there. Whereas if someone was to come to me and they're already running, they might be doing 4 hours on the weekend and they're doing a couple of runs through the week in a midweek long run, well, they've got a different starting point. So you just tailor it to where that individual is actually at. And because what I do is all, not all, actually, it's kind of a lie, but with my one-on-one coaching, it's all individualized. And so because of that, it means that it doesn't matter what strengths or weaknesses the runner brings. I'm basically looking at that and then working with them. And so that's how basically I can coach front of pack, mid pack, and top of pack athletes.
Oh, very good. Very good. Well, let's talk a little bit about RunFit as a methodology. Because, what I found in reading RunFit that I thought was quite interesting was you're making a distinction less around kind of that beginner, intermediate, advanced, and more about the mindset of somebody that wants to improve continually. So it'd be great if you could speak a little bit to RunFit as a framework or a methodology, and how does that connect your latest book, which is titled RunFit, into how you work with your clients and in your coaching business?
Yeah, totally. So RunFit, I guess just to give your listeners an understanding of the method, imagine you have like 4 dinner plates, 2 on top and 2 on the bottom. And they're kind of like the 4 key areas that I end up unpacking. And those 4 overlap. And so you'd have the game plan, you'd have the mindset, you'd have the skill set, and you'd have the fitness. And at the junction of those 4 dinner plates in the middle, when they all overlap, that's actually what a runner is after, be it yourself or someone who is, even chasing the Olympics or an ultramarathon runner. It's actually goes across every single discipline of running. And basically that RunFit is at that center. And it's only when you get the intersection of those 4 dinner plates or those 4 areas coming together that you can actually achieve that. And so as a coach, what becomes quickly apparent is that runners absolutely rock at the fitness. Like that's where they spend all their time. They might not get it quite right, okay, because each of those areas has 3 sub areas that I unpack in the book. And so they spend all their time there, but they just don't spend the time in the other areas. And so because of that, they're just leaving time on the table or improvement on the table. And so this really unpacks that methodology that allows them to improve. And it can be applied if you're, like say yourself, that's really common. Someone who's previously been a runner or been involved in team sport goes away and then comes back to it, a bit later in life. Or someone who, is younger than you and say, might be straight away, like they've finished college, they just, they want to go to, that's their sport of choice basically. And they want to basically straight away tackle things. So it doesn't matter on your level. It's also a underpinning philosophy of running. And so it really unpacks a lot of the mistakes and the understanding that a lot of runners have. And I sort of then, I guess, explain how they could possibly change that perspective to really improve their running, because a lot of runners come in and they're really short-sighted. And so when I say short-sighted, they're chasing, I've got a marathon in 12 weeks, or I've got a half marathon I want to do in 6 weeks. I've worked with athletes for 3+ years, and they're continuing to improve to this day. What I do with them now would have absolutely broke them back in year 1. Okay, they would have ended up with injuries. They just couldn't have done it because their body wasn't at the ability that it could handle it, but they now can. And that, that sort of improvement, if I think at 100 kilometer sort of distance, I always look for, whatever someone's done beforehand, I like to take an hour off their time. Okay. First run. And then the second one, I'm aiming to take a half hour off. And then the third time, so in 3 years, I'm aiming to take 15 minutes off. So it's just kind of like you halve it each time. And so I've managed to do that with a guy who actually had read and started training under Journey to 100 and read that book prior to doing his first. And I coached him for the last bit, but I've still been able to, pull an hour 20 off his time. So that's kind of, it's the underlying methodology that I use in all my coaching. And it really unpacks that so that those I work with can actually go, oh, right, when Nick's asking me to do this, I can understand where he's coming from rather than not understanding the why.
Yeah, right. And that really, I'm sure, sets you up as the expert in their mind, right? It shows that you're more than just somebody who knows how to run. You're somebody who's really thought about the underlying mechanics of what makes a good runner and how to train people. I really, really, really love that. Now, many people aspire to write a book, but only a small fraction ever make it happen. You've now written 3 books. What is it that made you want to continue writing and publishing instead of just, ticking that box after your first book and calling it a day?
Yeah, it's interesting. What I guess I'd also like to precede this. I wrote the first book and straight away I'd written the first book and everyone would ask me, so when's the next one coming out? And I already knew that it was there, but I couldn't kind of believe it. But I just love the process. It just falls, it's exactly like running. And so kind of as you mentioned earlier, basically you have to be able to put, small steps in place over a really long period of time to be able to write a book. You've got to follow a really detailed process. It requires meticulous planning. And then you've obviously got to go through then the process of editing and everything that follows beyond that. But it's actually really structured. And I actually love that structure and what it kind of comes out to at the end. And so I see it really as like a mental kind of representation of doing an Ironman or doing an ultramarathon, in the sense that, basically I'm putting small steps in place over like a long period of time. And we do more than one race. Okay. It's not like you do one marathon. You're like, oh yeah, I'm done with marathons now. Like, you want to do another one. And so, for me, writing is the same. I really enjoy it. I love, as I said, that process and all those different components that really, challenge me. And so it gives me that mental challenge, because I can't actually run like all the time every day. Okay. So I've got to be able to do something else with my time. So I spend some time writing books as well. But, beyond that, you kind of need something, I guess, a little bit more as well. And so my first book, I actually wrote it, as everyone, like, you want to write a book, okay? But what really gave me confidence was that I'm like, even if I only give this to the runners that I work with, then that's already achieved enough for me. And anyone else who reads it is really a bonus. And so the conversations or what I unpack in the first book, that's Journey to 100 for any listeners wondering, is a bunch of conversations that I would actually have to go through with anyone that was to start coaching with me. And so I can basically give it to them and it guides them through it the right way every single time. Okay. And they can then read it and it's come from me. And then, a lot of athletes say, it's like you're talking to me, Nick. I'm like, well, yeah, that's like what writing is. It's just an extenuation of our voice. And so then when they start coaching with me, they have that understanding of the why, not just from what I program, but also because they've managed to read the book and they can understand how it all comes together. And so that was, I guess, my driving factor for the first one. Obviously, there was additional like cherries on top, which was, naturally to build my authority in that area, because I wasn't well known, as I mentioned earlier, in the trail and ultra running scene. So that was also definitely something that from a business perspective, I was really after from it. But I knew that even if it just achieved that other bit, I was happy. And that was more than enough to make it worthwhile. So that's kind of, I guess, led on to onto the the books that have followed. So the Journey to Kona is kind of the triathlon equivalent of Journey to 100, which was sort of a natural progression for me, going back to what was my upbringing in sport. And then really Run Fit is that more philosophy and overarching unpacking of what we do. So if anyone, like any of those that I coach or anyone else, I always say, we'll start with Run Fit, read that. That'll give you this big picture understanding of what we're trying to achieve. And then the Journey to 100 or Journey to Kona is actually like the nitty gritty. It's how we actually get in there and do it. But I'm pretty blessed that I get emails or I'll speak to people, and particularly Journey to 100. I guess just because I spend more time in the trail and ultra scene, and they're like, yeah, Nick, I've got like sticky tabs all throughout the book. I've read it twice and I keep referring to it. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty special, because I didn't see that coming from it. And so while I know it's been of value to, those that I speak to, if I hear that from those that I speak to, I know that it's delivering value to, so many other people around the world. And that's pretty special to know that I've helped someone. Actually, I don't know how, but up in Canada, I have a few books that go up there, because I can see from on Amazon that, more seem to go there than, other places. And so it's like, wow, there's some ultra runners up in Canada that are achieving cool things because of a little book that a guy in Adelaide wrote. So that's the power of the text.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's amazing. It's so nice to know that you're having that impact, even if you don't necessarily know who the individual is at a particular point in time. So as you've written, your subsequent books, what did you learn about the writing process? What did you learn by now that you wish you'd known back when you sat down to write Journey to 100?
I swear, each book I've written, I'm like, was it really this hard? Like, I don't know, somehow you forget. And then you're like in the middle of it and you're like, oh my goodness, like it is freaking, like it is hard work. I'm not going to lie. So I don't know. I guess I'm fortunate that my coaching background played a real strength in the fact of my planning. But I guess the thing that I always say to everyone that then speaks to me about writing a book, plan, and keep planning. So I was really fortunate. I had no idea how to write a book. And so obviously someone that well, Jackie, she wrote a book that obviously that you're aware well of at Grammar Factory.
Book Blueprint.
Yeah. I had to think of it for a second. I had the mental blank. And so I literally read her book to understand how to write a book. Now, if it wasn't for that, the mistake I would have made would have been not planning to the extent that I needed to. So while I didn't have that problem, that is by far the biggest problem that I see coming across. And that's what I recommend to everyone. Just like plan, and plan again. Interestingly, probably actually, no, I lie. You've actually unpacked it. I haven't read your book, but all good authors will look through the contents page to get a real feel for the book. And that was something that I actually hadn't considered. Your part 5, which is you'll have to correct me, but it's basically along the lines of how to monetize your business through your book. And that was something I didn't do in my first book. And that's something that I could have done far better. And so if I had have had that understanding at the time, it would have changed a few things that I did within the book. It wouldn't have changed the overall value that it delivers, but it absolutely would have meant that it would have allowed me to progress in business faster than what I would have. So, yeah. And Scott had no idea I was about to say that. So, yeah.
No, that's absolutely great. That's great. Because you're right. I've and that's what's a little bit different, I find, between a professional writer, an author who's writing a book for the sake of selling books and building a following of readers. For those authors, it's almost exclusively about the reader journey. And for those of us that are writing a nonfiction book that is linked to our business, that reader journey is still vitally important, but there's that other lens of how are you going to monetize it? How are you going to get value for yourself as an author and for your business? And, I think you're bang on it. That's where I see a lot of first-time authors not really putting that thought into how they're going to get that value for themselves, and that's so important. So I'm really happy to hear that that you feel like you've managed to do that with subsequent books.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. I actually it's probably a mistake I made in my first 2 books, and I was happy to have achieved it without. Was probably somewhere where I was, it was different, like in the sense that it still delivered great value and it still achieved that authority that I was after. But it's definitely something I would change, would be to make sure that I could have, fast-tracked and got additional benefit for my business out of that. So yeah, no, you're spot on there.
Yeah. So you talked about the importance of planning, both for writing a book and for endurance running. Are there any other parallels that you see, at least in terms of the mental discipline required to write a book versus, say running a marathon? And what tips might you give to somebody training for their first race that might also hold true for somebody who wants to write their first book?
Yeah, great question. So they are so alike that it's uncanny, and so yeah, it's really coming back to accepting that you've just got to, as I sort of mentioned earlier, do a little bit each day or do a little bit consistently over a long period of time, and not becoming overwhelmed at the task. You are always going to end up at a spot in the middle, probably when you're at about, depending on how long your book is, probably 25 to 30,000 words. And I didn't realize my first 2 books are like Bohemus. So they're 55,000 words. And I'd never written a book before. I thought that was just a book, but obviously a lot of books end up being around the 30,000 words in the sort of entrepreneur space. So it was kind of, it's almost a double book. And that's before you put like the training plan that is actually in those books as well, which are quite substantial. So I must have been at like, 30,000 words, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, like, is this thing going to end? But you just keep going. And so it's the same in your training. Like you go out for runs and you have runs that, you kind of don't want to do, but you're just like, you know what? It's raining, it's cold, it's wet, but I just got to go do it. And next week it'll be great. So that sort of fortitude is definitely important. The other thing that's probably of interest to, your listeners and things and people writing a book is I've actually written my first 3 books in a different way each. And so it's dependent on what's been happening in my life at the time. So my first one, Journey to 100, as you can probably sort of pick from my personality and what I do, I'm a bit gung-ho. So I had all the planning done. And basically New Year's Day, I'm like, I'm going to start writing this book. And I'd booked a time in with one of the editors at Grammar Factory. And so I'd booked that in because that was keeping me accountable. And so I was like, yep, my birthday's in March. Okay, I'm going to write it by then. And so all the planning was done because obviously the planning takes a chunk, but the actual writing, I'm going to start New Year's Day and I'm going to just freaking charge it because I was teaching at the stage, had the summer holidays, and I'm just going to write every day. And I started doing that and it was like, cool. And I got there and I just kept going and going. And like, it was like, I was super motivated, obviously. And then basically school sort of went back into January and it's like, okay, got to keep writing. So then I was getting up before work. I'd go down to the coffee shop. I'd basically, get there when it opened, write for a couple of hours, and I'd go teach for the day. I'd go back to the coffee shop after, write for a couple more hours. And basically that was how I did it. So I kind of see that as the chip and charge method. It's just like, you just launch yourself into it and you just write. Like I'm talking the first 4 weeks, that was pretty much all I was doing all day. And so that definitely put me to a point that I was kind of like a week or 2 out and I'm like, I'm not going to make this deadline. And so I've emailed, obviously, Jackie at that stage, but Caroline, and I'm like, guys, like I could do it by, pulling some all-nighters. And I was like, guys, I'm just not going to quite make that. And so they said, that's okay. We'll reschedule down the track. And so I then just put it away because it was about a month away, or 6 weeks away was the next spot I could get. And so I then I didn't want to look at it. And I needed some downtime from it because I was just mentally cooked. And so I basically then pulled it back out and then continued to write until I obviously finished it. But while I was doing that, because it was so mentally challenging, I basically used the Pomodoro method, which for anyone that doesn't know is literally a timer. And I would basically go for 20-minute blocks, but it doesn't time out at the end. And so then often that 20 minutes would end up being like a 30-minute or 40-minute block. And then I get my 5-minute break. And then I grab a coffee, I go for a walk, I just, freaking look at Facebook, anything but. And then I'd basically go back into it and do another block of 20 minutes, which would often end up being, again, 30 or 40 minutes. And if I could get through 3 of those a day, then that was I was doing pretty well. This is when I was teaching. And so, basically I didn't know how many times I had to freaking hit that go timer, but I knew eventually I wouldn't have to do it again. And so that was what propelled me through it. The second book, I was, coaching a lot more then at that stage, and still had to do some relief teaching and stuff, but I was traveling a lot with the job I had. And so I basically employed the travel method or the plane method. And so I wrote it, I was going over to New Zealand basically once a month. And so on the flight over, basically pull out the laptop and I do the next chunk. Flight back, pull out the laptop, do the next chunk. And I had then also, just purely by coincidence, that's where my brother played over in Israel, and I went and visited him. That was a couple of long distance trips. And everyone else has got the movies going, and I'm in the middle row. Everyone else is then asleep, and there's one light on in the middle. And I'm basically punching away on the keyboard, just getting this thing written. And then I'm like, oh, come on, dimming the lights on the keyboard, turning it all off so that I can get maximum battery life. And then charging it when I go to the next airport, and then doing it again. So, that ends up being probably 30 hours of just solid writing. Time there. And so that was how I wrote it, was on planes, because there's just no distractions. So you can just get into your flow. And then the third book, and this is the one that I think works probably for most people. And that's basically, you've done all the planning, and when you decide to write, you just get up at 5:30. And I wrote 5:30 till 7. And then I went and did my normal day's work. And I just did that. Basically, I did it Monday to Friday. I actually did it. So Monday to Friday, I run Thursday mornings with a group. So it was basically Monday to Friday, but missed one of those. And I just did that until it was written. And it probably took, 8 to 12 weeks. But you've got the backbone of the book, and then it obviously goes through the editing process, which is massively important. And then once I've got it back, I just continue that process again. But it means that anyone can fit writing a book into their day. There's just no excuses. You're tired for the first week, the first 2 weeks, but eventually your body clock just goes nut, and you're basically up. And I started just naturally waking up at 5 o'clock, writing from 5 till 7, because at the end of the day, I'm tired and I'm going to bed. So that's kind of the method I lean to for everyone. But you could do, book lock yourself in a cabin for 2 weeks, do 2 weeks there, and then revert to the other method if you really want to get a head start. So.
Yeah, that's really good suggestion. I found the same thing when I was writing my book. That whole getting up early. We just had our son, so I knew that at a certain point he'd be waking up, so I had to get up before him and then write for a little bit, get it all done. But that's great. So listen, entrepreneurs are usually high achievers who are continually looking to challenge themselves. So for listeners who may be keen to learn more about your community and your approach to how you help people train, what's the best way to learn more or get in touch with you? We're going to put all your links in the show notes, but if there's one place that you'd encourage people to go, where's that?
Yeah, definitely. And you'll see a little bit of the niching, unniching coming out here, because I've got basically 3 different businesses ultimately that sort of function under one. So I've got the Ultra Journey, which is the one that I'm probably most well known for. I've then got and that's for the trail runners and the ultramarathon runners. I've then got the Kona Journey, which is for the triathletes, obviously in particular Ironman triathletes. And then I've also got the Run Journey, which is for really the road runners or the half marathon runners and the marathon runners. But yeah, so either of those, I've got a website set up at each. They're all independent, but everything comes back to me. And then from that, I've got probably for any runners, a fantastic starting spot is like a scorecard I've set up, which really unpacks your understanding around the RunFit methodology. And that's at scorecard.therunjourney.com. And then, yeah, any of the websites which are, basically if you Google those different names, they'll come up. And yeah, basically you can access and find, a bunch of blogs I've got on there as well. And that's probably a good spot to get started. But yeah, I'd definitely say, to read the book is probably a good starting point. For those in Australia, it's available online. For those that are overseas, obviously it's, in all the, Amazon and all the other relevant places, because postage kind of sucks from Australia over there. But yeah, I guess the other thing is, if anyone does want to connect with me, I coach runners both in Australia, interstate for me, but also overseas. And so people are often a little bit confused by that. They're like, you're a running coach and you coach people overseas. It's like, yeah, because I'm looking at what's called the periodization, so the science and the structure of training over a long period of time. So yeah, I've got some runners up through Europe and whatnot. No one in Canada yet, but I'm really keen to get Canada or America. So I will put a shout out to anyone over there.
We'll see if we can help you with that.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's probably the best spot to go.
Awesome. Okay, well, we'll put all of those links in the show notes. That way people can Google, but they can also find it all in the show notes too. Nick, it's been so helpful to hear about your entrepreneur to author journey and how you're helping runners, like you say, around the world to get run fit and finish with a smile. So thank you so much for being generous with your time with us today.
No worries. Thanks for having me on, Scott. And yeah, definitely, if anyone's got any questions, feel free to sing out or reach out, and I'll get back to them.
Nick clearly knows how to get across the finish line, whether that's 100 kilometers into a race or 50,000 words into a manuscript. And as we wrap up this episode of Entrepreneur to Author, remember this. If you're struggling to find the right niche for your business, a little trial and error isn't always a bad thing. Start by niching down heavy, then widen your focus a bit if it feels too tight. As with long-distance running, planning out your book before writing is critical. It's going to make the writing so much easier and ensure that your book covers all of the content that you need it to. As Nick pointed out, there are multiple ways to get your writing done. Head down until it's finished may work for you, or writing in the in-between spaces, like on a plane, might work better. But for most people, setting aside an hour or two each day to write and then continuing on with your day is the best way to make solid, consistent progress on your manuscript. Before you know it, your book is written. Now is the time. Time to write, time to publish, and time to grow. I'm Scott McMillan. Until next time.